This afternoon, I want to begin by welcoming Tyler Hamman, our Vice President of Government Relations, and he'll introduce our congressional panel on the stage. Tyler?
Thank you, Director Pearson. As he mentioned, my name is Tyler Hamman. I'm your Vice President of Government Relations here at Basin Electric. And we have a unique opportunity today to mix up this year's Government Relations report with the annual meeting being moved to the August Congressional recess. We're able to have three familiar faces join us here today, and we're going to talk about what they're working on back in our nation's capital. I think since we last got together in November, it's been a very busy 9 months of state and federal legislative activity. I think we could probably spend the duration of today's meeting talking about these issues, but what we hope to do in the next hour is cover a snapshot of how Washington is impacting electric cooperatives and rural America. So if I can, I'm going to introduce our panelists here. First, it's my privilege to introduce Senator John Hoeven. Senator Hoeven was sworn in as North Dakota's 22nd U.S. Senator in 2011, following 10 years of service as Governor of North Dakota. He serves as a senior member of the Appropriations, Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry, Energy and Natural Resources, and Indian Affairs Committees. Senator Hoeven has worked tirelessly at the state and federal level to advance North Dakota's energy industry. Next, I'd like to introduce Senator Steve Daines. Senator Daines was sworn into the Senate in 2015 after serving as Montana's at-large representative in the U.S. House. In addition to serving with Senator Hoeven on the Energy and Natural Resources and Indian Affairs Committees, he is also a member of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, as well as the Finance Committee, which plays a key role in our nation's tax policy. And I want to say a special thank you for making the trip from Montana to be with us today. Appreciate that. I'm also pleased to introduce Senator Kevin Cramer. Senator Cramer was elected to the United States Senate in 2018 after serving 3 terms as North Dakota's at-large member of the House of Representatives. The senator serves on the Armed Services, Environment and Public Works, and Veteran Affairs Committees, and also sits with Senator Daines on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. I'd also add that Senator Cramer gained firsthand experience with our industry after being appointed by someone else on this stage, then Governor John Hoeven, to the North Dakota Public Service Commission in 2003, where he was subsequently elected prior to running for the House. And then finally, to help me moderate this panel, I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul Gutierrez with the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Paul is the senior tax and transportation lobbyist. Paul is a senior lobbyist for tax and transportation issues for our National Trade Association, which he first joined in 2013. He grew up on a cow-calf operation in Magdalena, New Mexico, and got a degree in Ag Econ from New Mexico State. So please help me welcome our panelists. And before we get started here, I just wanted to open up to each of you senators if you have any opening remarks you want to make. So maybe we'll just go down the line. Senator Cramer, if you want to begin.
Well, given the short time, I'm going to wait for questions, but I would just say this. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Great always to be with my colleagues, Senator Daines and Senator Hoeven. Senator Hoeven and I hang around North Dakota together quite a bit, as you might imagine, and to be with Paul. And the only thing I would say up front is it's an honor always to come to the Basin annual meeting. It's always an honor to be part of anything that involves the rural electric cooperatives. Because one of the great things about America, of course, is that we're self-governed, and the greatest governance of all is self-governance. And as a former regulator of rates for investor-owned utilities, I always had much more respect for the consumers of rural electrics who actually helped set their own rates and hold their employees and administrations accountable, because it matters most to you. And so to those directors from the distribution co-ops as well as Basin's directors that are giving the irrevocable gift of your time to be part of the governing of your local co-op. Thank you for what you do, because really, if it weren't for the rural electrics, many of the fights that we're fighting, we'd be much more alone. So thank you, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Well, I'm very glad to be here, and I probably have to thank Senator Cramer for telling me you got to come to this Basin event in North Dakota in August. And I'll tell you, I'm very glad to be here. I left my hometown of Bozeman this morning at 6 a.m. on Delta, came to Minneapolis, got into Bismarck, and I'll tell you why I'm glad to be here for a couple reasons. One, On the issue of energy, I am passionate. If somebody asks, Steve, pick a topic and just come and speak about it, typically I'll say, I want to speak about energy. Because if we get energy right, in terms of energy policies in this country, a lot of things work out pretty well on their own. But if we get energy wrong, the consequences could be absolutely severe, if not dire. When you think about the fact that the world is going to need 50% more energy in the next 25 years than it needs today. That's something that I think a lot of kids in our high schools or junior highs are not hearing from their teachers, is that it's not as if energy demand is going to be diminishing over the course of the next 25 years. It's going to increase globally by 50% more than what we consume today. And that's why it's so important we get this. Senator Hoeven just a minute ago was using the word common sense, bringing common sense and reality to this discussion on energy. And lastly, I'll say this, our rural co-ops back in Montana, I know we've got some Montanans here today, glad to have you out here in the audience. Our rural co-ops, when they come to Washington, I've always said and will continue to say, they in many ways present the most accurate cross-section of our state. It tends to be nonpartisan, it tends to be very pragmatic, it's focused on reality because it's about providing reliable, affordable, resilient energy to Montanans. In some cases, that can be a life or death issue, as folks in North Dakota and Montana know, with a real cold winter, which we have. So I want to thank you for your advocacy and what you do and how you bring the young people to Washington to see it firsthand as well.
Thank you. Senator Hoeven.
Thanks, Tyler. It's great to be here at Basin's meeting. Welcome to all of you, not just from across North Dakota, but from the 9-state region that Basin serves. And it's great and also fun to be up here on this panel with Senator Cramer. I could not have a better colleague in the Senate. One of the first things he did when he came, because I was already there, I already had my committee assignments, he figured out which committee assignments would work best with the ones I have on behalf of North Dakota and our country. And a good example is in energy. Senator Daines and I are on energy and natural resources, and so Kevin got on EPW, Environment and Public Works. That is absolutely the other side of the coin and makes us much more effective. I'm on defense appropriations, so he gets on armed services. Again, same thing, and that's how he thinks. And not just because he's a smart guy, but he thinks these things through, and that makes him much more effective for the people that he serves, and he certainly does a great job, and he's great to work with. And then Steve Daines, I'd met Steve before he actually ran, and he was already working on these things. He had a great background in technology, did some amazing things, really on a global basis. He spent a lot of time in places like China, which think how important that is now, understanding what's really going on over there. So he's got those life experiences, but he was working on a lot of the issues that he now works on in the Senate, and he's already in a leadership role with our caucus and doing a great job. And of course, we love Montana, one of our neighboring states, and share so much in terms of energy, agriculture, and many other things. And the last thing I would say is that Basin is leading the way. And I think you have for a long, long time, but there's no question in terms of what's going on right now in energy, you are leading the way. Cost-effective, dependable energy. And I like that reference to common sense, Steve. I really appreciate it. I think you lead with not only the latest, greatest technology and innovation and true leadership and responsibility to all the people you serve, but that common sense. I've both in my role as governor and in the Senate, have had the good fortune to work with you as you provided that base load, dependable energy which this country needs, and you've worked through and solved in a leadership role, SOx, NOx, mercury, and now you're going to do it with CO2. You are doing it with CO2, and we'll talk more about that. That is true leadership that not only serves all of the people that you work for across that 9-state region, but our country.
Great. Thank you for that. So we have a few questions lined up for you guys. I'll go ahead and get started here. I think you all know well enough. We spend a lot of time these days talking about reliability. So a question for each of you is, what do you see as the biggest policy implications currently impacting reliability? Maybe Senator Daines, do you want to start?
You know, many of us have watched what's happened in Europe over the course of the last less than 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine. And watching the consequences of bad energy policy and seeing what that means in terms of increased rates and putting economies at risk. After the invasion of Ukraine, I went over, in fact, I visited 13 countries over the course of the last about 18 months, talking with prime ministers, with presidents, with energy ministers on primarily an energy-focused agenda, as well as security, certainly with the Russian invasion. And I remember meeting with the Romanian Prime Minister Ciucă. He'd been a tank commander in Afghanistan, serving alongside U.S. forces years ago, very pro-America. And Prime Minister Ciucă, we spent 3 hours talking about a lot of issues, but mostly energy as it relates to Romania. And he was lamenting the choices that had been made in policy to some of his Northern European friends about shutting down baseload power, shutting down coal plants, shutting down nuclear plants, kind of having a strategy of hope versus something that was realistic. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Senator, a vision without a solid action plan is a hallucination." I've never forgotten that statement. And I think it concerns us back in Washington. We're looking at what's coming down from the EPA, these mandates from these very powerful executive agencies. We see what activist judges are doing at the moment here. And we saw certainly in Montana shutting down the Keystone Pipeline. This worries me, and I know it worries many of us greatly, in the power that's wielded almost unilaterally in Washington that is undermining the ability to continue to expand our energy production, diversify our energy production, versus mandating this replacement strategy of taking conventional sources of energy and low-cost coal, oil, natural gas, and saying these are going to be discontinued and replaced with only renewables. And lastly, I'll say, I don't think anybody up here is opposed to renewable energy. It's an exciting future. It's something that we need to continue to let technology develop. But given that we need 50% more energy in the next 25 years, why aren't we using it to expand our portfolio, give us more options, rather than using it as a way to restrict our portfolio by mandating these replacements and shutting down affordable, reliable energy?
Well said. I don't think we need to cease with formalities here, but whichever one of you wants to jump in next on that, Senator Hoeven or Cramer.
Well, let me just say, I agree, first of all, with everything that Steve says, and it's the religious left that worships at the altar of climatology that presents a great threat. But that shouldn't be a threat if we had responsible leadership. To me, the scariest thing, the greatest threat to the common sense that Senator Hoeven talks about is the growing power of the administrative state. That fourth branch of unelected bureaucrats who have the luxury of not having to produce anything to get a paycheck, they get to apply this idealism to real policies. On the encouraging side of it, our Supreme Court just in the last year has pushed back against the administrative state. First and probably most dramatically in West Virginia versus EPA, where North Dakota is obviously one of the parties to that case. Rolling back the CPP, the Clean Power Plan from the Obama administration, and applying very strongly what they call the major questions doctrine. The major questions doctrine is simply that as the administrative state, the only authority you have is what's granted to you by Congress, and that the absence of a prohibition in the law is not a license for you to make up the gaps. And that was huge, a huge victory in and of itself for energy. But then follow that up with the Waters of the United States rule, again, similar, applying that, no, I'm sorry, but in the Clean Water Act, it doesn't say that a navigable water is every raindrop that falls from the sky or every creek or every wetland or slough, but rather defines more specifically what that really means in what it says in the Clean Water Act. Now, the next one that's coming forward is a Chevron doctrine case that they're going to take up. Another one, the Chevron doctrine, of course, for decades has said in the absence of clarity or specificity in the law, we turn we turn to the administrative agency that has the subject matter expertise. And we defer to them. We defer to the agencies. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I expect that they'll overturn that. So I'm encouraged on the one hand. On the other hand, the great threat is unelected bureaucrats making major economic policy that the Constitution nor the Congress has ever given.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add, Tyler, is that, look, it's not just about being energy independent in this country. We need to be energy dominant. It's not just about knocking down inflation. It's not just about making sure that we continue to grow and create more jobs in terms of our economy. It really is a security issue, a national security issue. It makes us secure here at home, and it also helps our allies. And we can be energy dominant. We should be energy dominant right now. And the key is for us as policymakers is to work with you to make sure that we establish that. And that means, and just picking up on what both these gentlemen have said, and that is that we have to produce energy from all sources, and we can do that, but we need to do it in a practical, realistic, common sense way that makes us energy dominant.
Excellent.
A question for all three of you. You all have been the leaders in carbon sequestration, utilization, storage, the tax credits 45Q. I think you all have co-sponsored standalone bills. Looking going forward, obviously Basin is making a lot of investments. They've been a leader in this area. Looking at that tax credit moving forward, it's enjoyed bipartisan support. Do you think that it will continue to enjoy that bipartisan support going forward to allow some certainty for these companies to continue to invest and make sure that to fruition? And I guess I'd start with Senator Cramer and just come down this way, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would have started with Senator Hoeven on that one. But let me say, I do think it does. It's not easy, don't get me wrong. But the Senate is sort of a wonderful institution, not only because every small state has just as many senators as every big state, which I think makes it very, very special, but in that it takes 60 senators to change a law or to pass a new law, particularly one as significant as tax policy. And because of that, regardless of how much support 45Q or other tax policies have going forward in either party or either chamber, the fact that it's the law of the land today, I think, largely, sort of embeds it, if you will. Now, those of us that support it, we have to be certain that we're going to stand up to whatever other pressures come our way. But 45Q, I think you could be sure from us, it's so critical to the future of baseload electricity and the fuel sources that can provide it that I just don't see us turning back.
So one thing that's true in Washington at the moment is the margins are very, very narrow. We have a divided government in the sense of the House has a narrow Republican majority. The Senate has a narrow Democrat majority. In fact, Kamala Harris has now broken more ties as vice president than any vice president in our nation's history. Just broke John Adams, who had the silver medal. Now Kamala shares the gold medal with John Calhoun, and they all had 8-year terms as vice president. Kamala Harris, in less than 3 years, has now broken more ties. And one of those ties she broke, these are consequential votes. 31 times she's been called from the White House down to the Senate floor to break a tie. One of those consequential votes was that so-called Inflation Reduction Act that was passed on a partisan basis. And she came down and broke that tie. But you take a look what the House did. When the Republicans got the House back, they passed a bill that really went after some of the provisions in that in that Inflation Reduction Act. But guess what? One of the provisions they didn't touch was 45Q. So I think that's a pretty good poker tell that says, hey, if the Republican House is not going to touch the 45Q provision, and as Senator Cramer just mentioned, it's a much higher hill to climb in the Senate with 60 votes. I think 45Q is not that you ever say anything safe in Washington, but it looks like we've got bipartisan support, as we should. You know, Denbury, I was there for their opening in Baker when they got their CO2 line where they're using it for enhanced oil recovery. I mean, it's a tremendous way here to use CO2 to actually go after some of these older wells and get more oil out of them. So I think you're going to see bipartisan support.
So I take a bit of a step back because it's not just 45Q, it's loan guarantees, it's funding for research and development and commercialization as well. In all the cases of all these new regulations that come down, the key is we have the capability from a technological standpoint to implement the new technologies and the new equipment and so forth to address those issues, whether it's SOx, NOx, mercury, or now CO2. But you can't go out of business doing it. You've got to be able to accomplish all those tasks you're given in terms of the law, the legal and regulatory and tax environment, and still be able to provide that dependable electricity and power every single day to consumers across this nation. And so if we want to make sure that we accomplish these things, we've got to put you and other energy companies in a position to do it. So we can, again, having been through the NOx, the SOx cycle, the NOx cycle, the mercury cycle, and of course they're trying to bring that back with the MATS regulation, as you've seen. But in terms of CO2, if people really want us to address CO2 emissions while still producing cost-effective, dependable power, and particularly base load for the grid, and remember, grid reliability is a huge issue here as well when we talk about base load, we've got to put you in a position to be able to make those innovations and not go out of business doing it. And so that's the whole point behind what we've put in place, which is not just the 45Q, but the tools to do that, which consists of upfront money for research and development and commercialization. Second, loan guarantees so that you can actually get the financing to make these very big investments to do it. And third, 45Q, so that there's some commercial viability to doing these things as you continue to enhance the technological viability. And we've seen that here. When I started as governor back in 2000, we drilled vertical wells. And the oil companies were leaving. We were 100,000 barrel a day going down. But we figured out how to crack the code on directional drilling. And so the Bakken opened up, the shale play opened up, and pretty soon we went from 100,000 to 1.5 million barrels a day. We cracked the code on the Bakken through the technology, but we created an environment where the companies could come here and do it. There's other places that have shale. So you also have to have an environment where companies can make the investment to do it. That's exactly the case now with 45Q and with the other tools we've put in place. And you all are the vanguard in making it happen. We can talk about DGC, we can talk about Project Tundra and Minn Kota and the crew, but you guys are the ones that are going to do it. I firmly believe you're going to crack the code, and that's American ingenuity at work. So yes, I believe these programs will stay in place and need to if people want these issues addressed so that you all can do just exactly what you're doing in a leadership role.
All great points. The research, the funding that's needed there. Let's just stay on taxes just for a moment, Senator Daines. Spring, we're looking at, an end of the year coming along. Is there any talk of an end-of-year package, a tax package coming together? And if so, is it going to be kind of more of an extenders package? Will it be broader? Will there be some pay-fors included in there? Can you give a little bit of insight as to what might happen in the tax space?
Yeah, well, trying to predict what Washington will do one day in advance enough, let alone by the end of the year. But my sense is that the first thing Washington has to deal with is the budgets. We've got the end of the fiscal year coming up, September 30th, and in typical DC fashion, that ball probably gets punted with some kind of continuing resolution. But that does provide a vehicle for some kind of perhaps extender package. I think the chance of that happening as we get closer now to an election probably diminish. And I don't think you're going to see any trades of taking some of the Inflation Reduction Act credit for maybe something else because, again, as Senator Cramer mentioned, some of these Inflation Reduction Act provisions are the holy grail for the left, for the Democrats. I mean, they wake up in the morning and they worship climate change and this green ideology. I call it a green hallucination. And so consequently, I think to get any kind of bipartisan cooperation at the moment is going to be difficult. So I would guess if there's chances for extenders, there's probably going to be something in a lame duck session following the election. I wouldn't be real optimistic something would happen here at the end of the year.
Great insight. Let's try to wake the crowd up a little bit from tax policy and go into environmental policy. Question for Senator Hoeven Cramer. In both your previous roles with the state and then moving into federal office, you had significant experience with EPA rulemakings as they applied to the electric power industry in North Dakota. You guys went through Regional Haze Round 1, MATS, the first iteration of the Clean Power Plan and the greenhouse gas rules. As those are now starting to come full circle with a rehashing of each one of those and then some, I guess I'd just ask you, based on your experience, what advice do you have for our industry, the state, other stakeholders, as we all work to try and push back against these harmful regulations and the potential impacts they have for grid reliability?
Go ahead. I'm not sure I got the question.
Sure,
Go
okay.
ahead. I had a little trouble picking
Well,
up
you know, our rule is answer the question you want to answer, not the one he asks. That's
Right,
what I did.
right. Good point.
Anyway, remember Ronald Reagan used to always say Nancy was fine when he got a question he didn't like? No, my view, you asked what's the most important thing you could do. One of the things I would say, I'll go back to what I said earlier about the new court, the new 6-3 conservative court and the major questions doctrine. I think what's coming down the pike in a lot of areas in terms of defense is going to be litigation. So make sure the state attorneys general are all well funded and that they have the right tools and the resources to be able to fight against what I think are unconstitutional and illegal actions. And I'll take up the next round of clean power. This response to West Virginia versus EPA with this new power plan violates the very same principles that the Supreme Court overturned them for on the Clean Power Plan, and that is major questions doctrine. It's fuel switching. You might remember, if you're going to have a law based on Section 111, particularly 111D for stationary sources, you can't demand fuel switching, which is exactly what the new rule does by forcing gas to go to hydrogen. That's a clear violation. You can't. Remember, they also said previously, the court, that you can't go outside the fence line. Well, even pipelines are outside the fence line. So even if you require carbon capture as the best technology, you're going to have to go outside the fence line. I think there's some real vulnerabilities there. That'd be one thing. But let me say on the other thing, I think the best opportunity in this divided government that we've been talking about is the opportunity to get some permitting reforms by giving the left a little bit of what they want and we get a little bit of what we want. Our founders created 3 co-equal branches of government, a bicameral legislature, all on purpose. And there are, Steve and John and I have 97 colleagues who don't get to be us, and 96 of them don't get to be from North Dakota or Montana, and so it's a diverse place. But there's some things they want, particularly on the transmission side, and I'm happy to delve into that a little more later, but this is sort of where I'm hanging out these days. If we want further siting reforms, for example, for pipelines, and for, frankly, any linear lines, then, certainly some expedited judicial review, changes around the fringes with NEPA would be good, but we're not going to get that unless they get some things on reforming transmission, but they want some really, really big things. So I'm glad to get into the weeds a little bit with you on that if you'd like, but I'd just say be ready to litigate on the one hand, but then on the other hand, be ready to negotiate, because it's amazing how different the world is apart from these great plains of ours.
So if I could add a point to it, Senator Cramer just brought up on the Supreme Court. Remember, it was in 2014, the Senate flipped parties. It went from Democrat control to Republican control. We didn't know, it was during Obama's second midterm election. We didn't know what that all meant until 2016 came along. You remember Justice Scalia passed away unexpectedly. And the Republicans decided to hold that Supreme Court nomination up until after the election. They held, would have been Merrick Garland would have been your Supreme Court member at the moment had we not stopped that. But we didn't realize there'd be 3 more bites of the apple in the Supreme Court over the course of the next several years. It was Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett. And we got that 6-3 court that Senator Cramer just mentioned that is doing exactly what you'd hope it'd do, is to reining in the overreach of some of these executive branches, whether it's that student loan giveaway the Supreme Court batted back, brought common sense back to some of these overreach on affirmative action, and then some of these major doctrine, these energy issues here with West Virginia. These are really profound cases. But let me just issue one little warning here looking over the horizon, is that the 2 oldest justices from the Supreme Court right now are Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito. So this next administration, whoever is elected president in 2024, may indeed have 2 Supreme Court nominations, and the 2 they might have would be to replace the two of the stalwarts coming from that center-right coalition on the Supreme Court. So that what's up in 24 is profound.
Tyler, I think both Kevin, Steve make really important points, and I think it was good for for Kevin to start with that one because he served on the PSC, and one of the things I've seen with him coming to Washington D.C., he understands these regulatory issues much better than a lot of the other members in the Senate, and including a lot of members of the Senate that are proposing legislation all the time. And if you're proposing legislation, you probably should understand it, and that isn't always true. So it really is good that he has that background because this regulatory stuff gets really complicated. But let me ask you, Tyler, what is Basin's makeup in terms of generating energy? What is your makeup between, base load, coal, gas, renewables, wind? What is it? Just percentage-wise, just name it off. I know you generally, just tell me.
Sure. Yeah, roughly speaking, still about 50% coal, 25% gas, 25% renewables, mostly wind, and some other mixed in.
So as you're out there advocating with policymakers or making your case, whether it's in the courts or whatever it is, but certainly starting with policymakers, because that's what we do, I'd start there. I'd start by saying, and it's something that Steve said right at the outset, we're not against renewables, but we're for actually good solutions, good environmental stewardship with the latest, greatest technology that give us cost-effective, dependable energy every day that makes us not only energy independent but energy dominant. Gee, look at us. We've got 25% renewables already. We've got gas, which is variable. We've got coal, which is the base load that's very important to this grid. We're moving ahead on the CO2. We've addressed SOx, NOx, and we've done all these things. We're doing these things. But you know what, policymakers, whether you're on the uber green side or whatever it be, you got to work with us. You've got to give us regulations that make sense. And if you do, we'll continue to develop these things you like, but we're going to continue to do the things we've got to do, whether it's coal or oil or gas and so on and so forth, to make sure that we're really doing what's best for not just America, but globally, because we're all already the best in terms of producing energy with the best environment. Nobody is better in terms of environmental stewardship than we are, and we'll keep making it better with innovation, but not if you give us these unrealistic, impractical mandates. And it's not just convincing the policymakers. We all have to work to make sure that the public writ large gets that, so they advocate for the right solutions and get the right policymakers that will bring forward those kinds of laws and regulation.
Yep, absolutely. I think we certainly have our, it's kind of an ongoing homework assignment for us to continue with the education piece. Governor Gordon from Wyoming spoke earlier this morning, and he mentioned EPA Administrator Regan came to our Dry Fork station outside of Gillette, Wyoming, talking about carbon capture technology and their new proposed greenhouse gas rules. So hopefully that was eye-opening for him to learn a little bit more about the realities on the ground with power generation.
If I just might say, Tyler, to that, the education everybody will get eventually, if we keep going down this path, are blackouts. their air conditioning not working in the summer, they're not having heat in the winter. I mean, the ultimate education will happen. Our job is to educate them before they learn the hard way, and that's a tough sell sometimes, but we have to be about it. This is why I love the co-ops so much, because you're not going to let that happen to yourselves. And I'm afraid not every business model works as well as yours.
Great. Thank you. Senator Cramer, I'm going to stick with you. You sit on the Environment and Public Works Committee, a very important committee as it pertains to the EPA. I think it's fair to say that Chairman Carper probably has a different perspective on these issues than you might, but all the same, what opportunities are there to hold EPA accountable with your work on that committee?
Yeah, first of all, in fairness to Tom Carper, who I love, he's a great chairman in the sense that he's a member's chairman, and the evidence of that is in the Environment and Public Works Committee. I'm the second ranking Republican on the committee, and I happen to chair the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee, and water, by the way. So when it comes to things like highway infrastructure, we passed an infrastructure bill, as you know, and bridges. Same with water resource development, WRDA bill. We've always passed those out unanimously out of the committee. And the reason for that is because we all, let me put it this way, with Tom Carper and me on the same dais, on the same committee, to get a unanimous vote means I got some things I want that he didn't want me to have, and he got some things he wanted that I didn't want him to have. So I think the committee works quite well. In terms of the direct oversight, we have our opportunities, and we've had some good ones where we were able to hold up. Right now, by the way, Goffman, who's he's the acting air chief or director of air for EPA. He's not been able to be confirmed. He didn't in the last Congress, and he hasn't gotten a vote yet in this Congress because we've been holding him to account with real specific questions and concerns, and that has allowed us, even with a one-member minority, to hold his confirmation up. So the committee does work, even in a bipartisan way, even in areas where you think they might not. Another one I could bring that comes to mind as you asked that question is we had the director of DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, right in the White House. Brenda Mallory was in front of the committee talking about, just sort of bringing us up to date on some things. And one of the Democratic members, this was, by the way, during the debate on the between Kevin McCarthy and the president on raising the debt ceiling. And you might recall there were some permitting reforms that ended up in that piece of legislation. And a Democratic member asked Brenda Mallory, right there on the dais, can you guarantee me that the president will not give Republicans some permitting reforms without insisting on transmission being part of the deal? And after he asked her multiple times because she avoided the question, she finally said, no, sir, I cannot. And we got permitting reforms in that bill without giving them anything on transmission. So in other words, the Senate's a special place, is all I can say. And when it comes to that part of the job, we can still do our jobs.
Senator Hoeven, let's turn to appropriations. You sit on the Appropriations Committee. Can you give just a little update as to where we are in the appropriations process? And then also, is there any possibility of putting riders on any of the appropriation bills to either slow down or stop the Clean Power Plant 2.0 rule? I know this has been done in the past, may be very difficult, but a little bit of an update and then any possibilities to at least slow roll what they're pushing out, if not stop.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And starting in terms of the appropriations bills, actually in the Senate now, we have moved all 12 appropriations bills through the full committee with good bipartisan support. So when we go back, we're ready to go to the floor. I think what you'll see is that they'll get paired up in what we call mini buses. So for example, I'm ranking on ag. We'll probably pair ag and maybe Milcon VA together, because those typically, I think, get pretty good support on a bipartisan basis, try to start off, get a win. But the key is, we've got them all out of committee. Now, the House at this point has passed one of the 12. That's it. But ours have to be bipartisan, again, the 60 votes. So if we can get to the floor and start moving them, I think that would be very helpful, not just for the Senate, but hopefully we bring the House along. And so that's something that we worked hard on before the August recess. We got all 12 done, which is, I think it's been over 20 years since that's happened.
Yeah.
And then as far as the riders, that will be very challenging. You know, it's going to have to be a rider that has quite a bit of bipartisan support, and then depending on the relative subcommittee, you know, strong support. So that'll be limited in what we can do there, but hopefully there are things we can do from a funding perspective that may be helpful if we're actually able to move those appropriations bills. We will certainly try. So don't get me wrong, we are always trying to get provisions that we think can be helpful in particularly in knocking down some of this regulatory burden. And as we go through the process of back and forth, sometimes we can get some of those. So that's kind of the state of play right now, and I'm hopeful when we get back in at the end of the month, we're on the floor right away.
That is no small feat to get all 12 bills through committee.
No, right? It's a miracle in here, as I can tell.
No, as I say, it hasn't been done in 20 years, so knock on wood, hopefully that's a good start.
Yeah, good deal. Senator Daines, a question for you. I think you've spent just about your entire time since you were first elected to Congress supporting the Keystone XL pipeline. My question is, and I don't intend for this to be a permitting question, but I think that's probably part of it, but what is your kind of high-level perspective, thoughts on certainty for energy infrastructure projects? What can Congress do to help ensure that federal approval for infrastructure projects can't just simply be undone at the stroke of a pen?
Yeah, well, I have a little PTSD right now when you mentioned Keystone Pipeline.
Should have given you a warning.
You remember in January of 2021, President Biden sworn into office. He gets up on the steps of the Capitol and gives a soaring speech about bringing the nation together, being bipartisan, and here we go, only to jump in the limo, head back to the White House, and sign the executive order unilaterally killing the Keystone XL pipeline. 1 million barrels a day. Oil, by the way, is about 100,000 barrels coming out of North Dakota and Montana, that Baker on-ramp there in eastern Montana. It just made absolutely no sense. You think about a pipeline emits the least amount of carbon versus transporting by rail or by truck. So environmentally, it made no sense. From a rural electric co-op viewpoint, my co-ops were telling me that because of the additional electricity they'd be supplying the pump stations on the Keystone XL pipeline, that ratepayers amongst those co-ops in eastern Montana would hold their rates flat for the next 10 years. Can you imagine the good news of somebody on fixed income in eastern Montana, some rancher that's got the pump running in the hot summer months in Montana, electric rates flat because of the increased volume, lower unit cost. There were so many wins, not to mention the jobs and so forth as well, and having more North American energy versus dependencies on adversaries for oil. It was a shocking event, but I think it illustrates the dangers of political leaders yielding to the whims and ideologies of the kind of the flavor of the month. In this case, it was shut down fossil fuel infrastructure. When I was in Lithuania in January, I went and visited the LNG terminal that Lithuania stood up. It is, the Europeans stood up a lot of infrastructure pretty fast because they had to after the invasion of Ukraine. You go out to that new LNG terminal in the Baltic Sea, there's a great big regasification floating tanker called the Independence. It's rightly named. And they take the LNG, 50% of the LNG coming in, of course, is from US companies into Europe and running it through their pipelines. I asked the LNG team about their career history. And the project manager said to me, she said, you know, before I was working on this project, I used to work at the nuclear plant in Lithuania. But the EU made us shut down the nuclear plant 20 years ago as a condition to join the EU, and Lithuania went from being a net energy exporter to being an energy importer. And this, again, is a warning shot of the insanity and the dangers of political leaders who yield to whims of shutting down baseload power. So back on the permitting reform question, we have got to move forward with permitting reform, and my colleagues on both sides of me here are two of the key leaders in the United States Senate. Proud of what they're doing here in permitting reform. But I would just add this to the permit reform discussion. Without judicial reforms paired with permitting reforms, I don't think we ever really solve the problem. We can make some incremental gains, but as a guy who comes from a Ninth Circuit court state, it's these activist judges, this California court, by the way, that killed the Keystone Pipeline the first time. It was Biden that killed it the second time. That we've got to address, and that's why these elections coming up in 24 are so important, because of all the votes we cast in the Senate, one of the most important votes is for a judicial nominee, because these are lifetime appointments. We can put a bad law in place and then can get changed, but you put a bad judge, they'll be there for a lifetime.
Tyler, if I could add to that. So Senate Bill 1, in, I think it was 15, I lose track, but that was my bill. It was the very first bill we put on the floor. The Republicans were in the majority in the Senate, and we passed approval of Keystone XL. And Kevin was same thing on the House side. So we passed it through the Senate and the House, and then President Obama vetoed it, okay? He got elected, he vetoed it. That was his call. But then President Trump comes in, and right away, he approved it by executive order. So you would think then it could have gotten built, right? Because they had at least 4 years. But because of this goes to what Steve was saying too, because of the regulatory burden, they couldn't get going and get it done. So 4 years they couldn't get it done. And this is after how many years they were working on it before. And like I say, to the point where we even passed a law through the Congress, it got vetoed by the president. But then they still had 4 more years and they couldn't get it done, even though they'd been working on it for a long time before that. And what did that result in? Then when a new administration came in, they were able to kill it. So back to that point that I think all three of us has made, we've got to be able to build things in a reasonable amount of time. Or we end up not getting things and we end up with much higher costs. And that's what you're seeing happen. Somehow we've got to get beyond this gridlock created by regulation.
Let me just put a fine point on all of that, because John described exactly right what happened in 2015. First of all, the reason that the Keystone XL, now when John appointed me to the Public Service Commission in North Dakota, I had the great blessing of having the pipeline portfolio, and we cited the first Keystone pipeline. Remember, there is a Keystone pipeline that goes through 600 landowners' land in eastern North Dakota, 9 counties. Not 1 inch of it had to be condemned or taken, because we have that kind of a savvy energy state. But the reason that the Keystone was so easily manipulated by a president is because it requires a presidential permit, because it crosses an international border. So the Keystone's a little unique. However, the principle's the same, in that if we don't have judicial review, so this is what's at stake, my friends, in permitting reform as we sit here and speak. The permitting reform that was done in the debt ceiling bill, good stuff. Not everything we need, but it was the right direction. Shorter timelines, shot clock type of things, even shorter appeal timelines, but still not significant expedited judicial review. So as long as you can litigate, you're going to have problems. Remember what I said, that what the left wants, they're on the fast track right now to get the FERC and the Department of Energy to take existing authorities and sort of manipulate those into a one-size-fits-all federalization of our grid. Why do they want to do that? They want to do that because they think that the solution is big lines, big wires from every wind farm to whoever wants the energy, regardless of how far that is, regardless of how much energy. You guys, we don't have enough generation for the type of transmission they want to build. And what's so offensive about that, and here's where I've drawn my bright line. I've said, if a state has a mandate of a certain amount of wind or a certain amount of renewables, the state has to pay for the transmission. Democrats don't want to do that. They want everybody to pay for it. They want cost allocation is one of the most important principles in rate making. The other one is just and reasonable rates. These are not just traditions, these are laws. These are precedents. And so they want the cost allocation to be everybody. And that means that if in the mountains of Montana they have a wind farm, and the state of Oregon wants that energy, but they don't want to put a wind farm in their mountains, and they don't want to put a wind farm out on their ocean floor, then they want you to pay for the transmission lines from Montana to Oregon and every state that it goes between. So my point being that the rich tradition and law of whoever benefits pays is what they want to violate. And the way they'll do that is change the benefit formula. Oh gosh, there's more competition, therefore everyone benefits. Oh, greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, therefore everyone benefits. The cost of that would be so astronomical as to be almost impossible, but it is their fantasy. So in the permitting reform piece, this is what I mean by we have to sort of decide what we'd be willing to tolerate for them to decide what they're willing to tolerate. But we also have to help educate them. Any type of linear infrastructure that is expedited is good for everybody. It's good for electric transmission, it's good for natural gas, it's good for oil, it's good for water, it's good for interstate highway systems. So we need to stay in the fight, but we cannot give up the whole thing for some small gains either.
We can pass the best permitting reform bill in the history of America, but if we don't make changes to the Endangered Species Act, as an example, which is part of the permitting reform universe, the left will use leverage and wherever they can find it. And you watch when they're starting to move through every type of grouse, every type of critter here to put them on the endangered species list as leverage to stop projects. We've seen that in Montana, up in the northwest part of our state, trying to get a mine permitted, a copper mine, and copper is sorely needed for the renewable economy. It's been 35 years in the making. Why? Environmental impact statements, studies put together, and then litigated in the Ninth Circuit. They remand it back. This has happened 7 times. I used to work for Procter & Gamble. I used to make shampoo and mouthwash for a living. It reminds me of lather, rinse, repeat. That's what they're doing right now with the judges. And the sad part about it is that time is money in the private sector. And you can't just sit there for 35 to 40 years trying to permit a mine that are held to the most stringent environmental standards in the world we have. We're proud of our conservation record. We can have both, but these activist judges combined with things like the Endangered Species Act are incredible barriers to getting infrastructure permitted.
By the way, the 10th Circuit just issued a victory for Wyoming. I think it was yesterday. I read about it in E&E today. Over a pipeline in Wyoming, the previous court and now the 10th Circuit has upheld that they can go ahead with that pipeline permit that the Department of the Interior green lighted over Endangered Species Act issues is relating to pronghorn and sage grouse, our favorite endangered bird that nobody wants.
The only thing more dangerous in Montana is hikers right now with grizzly bears. If you're out in Montana, yeah. I mean, grizzly bears are still an endangered species. It's a little bit of a local issue for us out west, but I'll tell you what, it's time to delist the bear, and that's the leverage using right now to stop a lot of projects in Montana, including timber projects.
At least you're not bitter about it.
I'm not.
It seems we segued into permitting reform, so Senator Hoeven, I would welcome any thoughts you might have too on that issue.
On which issue?
Permitting reform.
Well, to me it's very permitting. We talk permitting reform. It's so frustrating because number one, it's so complicated, and I mean I have a hard time ferreting through everything, and different senators on both sides of the aisle have brought things forward, and this is a solution, and so on and so forth. But I got to tell you, just when you say permitting reform, it's one of those terms of art. It's generic, it's general, but it's it's like beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and it's complicated. So number one, I get frustrated because it gets so intricate as to become unworkable. It so often is one size is supposed to fit all, which it never does. And then the other thing is, even if we manage to get some of these things in some of these bills that can pass, the administration just seems to ignore it and do it the way they want to. So it's like there's not enough teeth there, you know, to actually make them do it. So these guys can get into more details if they want. They probably know them better than, they certainly know them better than I do. But I'm kind of in that KISS method. Keep it simple, stupid. If it's that darn hard to understand, is it really gonna work? And can we enforce the darn thing? So if we're gonna do an EA or an EIS, let's set a time limit on that thing. Like 1 year for an EA and, I don't know, 18 months for an EIS. And you know what, if you don't have it done, then fine, it just got approved. And the law should direct that the courts, by gosh, that the general sense is that's what complies with the law. They met the timeline and got her done. So the burden of proof is on somebody that wants to overturn it. Now I'm not a lawyer, and I get that may not be how everybody wants to argue it all day long ad infinitum. But I think if we don't get down to some simple approaches like on this stuff, we're never going to get something that works, even if somebody runs out and tells you, oh, gee whiz, look, I got regulatory reform. Isn't that great? Well, no, it may not be very great. So that's kind of my point, is I really think we need to simplify this. It needs to be practical. It needs to be understandable. It can't be one size fits all, and it needs to be enforceable. Good. Other than that, I don't have any opinions on that.
Let's see, we're winding down into our final 30 seconds here. I just want to say, I know I spent some of my time working on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress who always made sure to tell us that there's no such thing as challenges, only opportunities for excellence. So we certainly appreciate your insight as we work as an industry and the cooperative family to navigate these opportunities for excellence. So let's give these guys a round of applause.